This is a pretty bizarre story. There are some details about my actual relationship I'm going to leave out. I kind of want an answer to this story question, but I don't think I'll ever get one. I've been wanting to get some outside opinions on it, aside from friends and family too. So, here goes. My ex-Jane and I lived about an hour away from each other. We met at a park out of state and ended up living kinda close. We hit it off and dated a month after we met. Our entire relationship lasted a year, and she was my first girlfriend. From the very beginning of the relationship, she would discuss her best friend named Patrick. He was in his late 20s, she, as a reminder, was 17, and worked in a bookstore. He lived in her town, and she had known him since she was 13. From very early on, I thought the stories she would tell about him were outlandish. She would talk about watching him get into bar fights with a guy that went by Hammer. How once he pretended to rob a gas station but left money behind on the counter, and had to jump off a roof to escape security, in which Patrick broke his ankle. Another time, Patrick got a brand new Mustang that they wanted to crash into a lake. So they jumped out at the last second. She told me that one toward the end of our relationship, at which point I was completely skeptical of everything she said. You get the idea. The stories she told seemed clearly exaggerated or downright fake. Part of me thought she was just trying to impress me for whatever reason. Here are some other important facts that I don't exactly know where to put, so I'll lay them out here. 1. Jane was an artist. She drew all the time in her journal. She rarely drew people as they actually were. She drew people as monsters or animals. For example, she always drew me as a giraffe. She was good at it. 2. Patrick's last name, according to her, was pronounced and spelled in a certain way. Willington. Patrick Willington. Patrick's dad owned a successful company out of state that Patrick would inherit. 4. Jane had a much older brother who was in his late 20s as well, that had joined the military and moved to Korea. She only saw him every few years or so. Okay, now continuing. Jane would tell me that Patrick was very protective of her. She would tell him about me and he would always be unsure of what he thought. She said he wanted to beat me up sometimes, and that he'd hurt me if I hurt her. If she told him about something silly I did, he'd think I was an idiot and call me stupid. He also thought I was gay. This is all, of course, second-hand information. Never once in the entire relationship do I think I spoke to him. I'll get to that later. I'd also like to remind everyone that this was my first relationship. I was very insecure, very confused, and there was more going on in it that complicated some things. I did not have the best rationality, as you may have already deduced from how weird some of this sounds. The thing is, I really didn't have any reason not to believe her, you know? She had no reason to lie about any of this, but I was still skeptical. Sometimes Jane would go to Patrick's house really late at night, she'd say. She said she'd sleep on his couch and that he would literally throw her out of the house in the morning. Sometimes, she said she'd sneak out of her house to go to his. He even lived within walking distance, apparently. One time later in the relationship, Patrick invited her on an out-of-state trip back to his hometown. They were going to stay in a mountain cabin for a week. I was not happy about that. I was more upset when she said she wouldn't tell her parents, and that they'd leave on a bus in the morning. Now at this point in the relationship, I was very unsure of what exactly was going on with this Patrick person. But Jane said that if I told her parents about this trip, that she wouldn't be able to go, and that Patrick would hate me and she'd be pissed. It was important to her because Patrick apparently would be forced to move away soon to work at his dad's company, and she'd never see him again. So she needed to go. Well, when the day came for her to leave, also I did discuss this with her friends and family at the time. Patrick never showed up to get her or whatever. She was very upset, even though he'd be back in town one more time. Oh, another tidbit. Jane's parents never once mentioned Patrick, ever. She never brought him up around them either. The only time she mentioned Patrick to anyone else was to my dad once after we broke up. She told my dad one of the outlandish stories I mentioned. Why she met my dad after we broke up is for a different, unrelated reason. That will not add to the story. My dad was flabbergasted. Basically, I had told him all about this, but hearing it in person was crazy. Patrick was to have a birthday party once, before the mountain cabin trip thing happened. I was invited. I was going to be at his house starting at midnight. I said I couldn't go to that, but that I'd get him a present. I got him some toolkit or something she said he'd like, and I gave it to her for him. She said she brought it, and that he did in fact like it. She said the party lasted until 6 a.m. Patrick sent me a text from her phone once, when she was with him. It was standard behavior for him. He said I was a pansy or something, and that he'd beat me up. That was early on. Sorry, things are out of order. I'm just kind of typing them as I remember. I'll edit anything I forget. Now here's where I think things get very interesting. Jane lived nearby in elementary school. She walked with me there and said his house was close to it. So she leads me to the back of the school, where there is this woodland. She brings me to the edge of the woods and has me look in. I see this very old wooden tin house sort of structure. It has broken windows, is filthy, it's falling apart. The path to it's covered by bushes and trees. She said that this was his house. Oh, at this point, he had moved to work at the company out of state. I asked if she was joking. She said no. And that he wasn't very tidy, even when he lived there. I thought briefly that maybe the house was just weird looking on the outside, but actually good inside. But there's no way it was. It was abandoned. Anyways, that same day, she asked if I wanted to go inside. It was hot, getting dark. No one knew where exactly we were, and I didn't want to get cut up by bushes or go in the sketchy house. So I said maybe another time. She insisted, saying that Patrick wanted us to check on things, but eventually gave up. This was very close to the end of our relationship. I asked her a few more questions like, you went through those bushes and stuff every time you went to see him? And she said yes, and that they had overgrown since he left. I also asked how he drove out of his house, how anyone visited him otherwise, how he got mail. She eventually realized that maybe I didn't exactly believe her and got mad. I said I was sorry, and that it was just different to me. She insisted it was true, and I let it go. Well, we ended up breaking up shortly after that, but I had a hard time coping with the breakup, and ended up speaking with her again later. She was on a bus with her class to go on some trip. Well, I lost connection with her, and called back. A young man answered. I asked who it was. He said, Patrick Willingson, not Willington. So I opened up a question about his last name, and also why he had her phone. He said that was always his last name. He says he was on his office phone. I kept asking him questions about himself that only the real Patrick would know. I heard noises in the background. He would pause for a minute before answering. I think she just handed the phone to a classmate and told him what to say, frankly. That's the only real answer to that. Well, he hung up and I called her back. Jane answered and said that Patrick told her I somehow got connected to his phone, since he was in her recent contacts or something. Clearly BS, but I played along, asking one more time about the last name, to which she had no idea what I was talking about, saying it was always Willingson, and left it at that. Oh, and he wanted to beat me up, of course, badly, for breaking her heart. Well, I kept speaking to her for a week or two, and we both finally got closure about the relationship. But as I was recounting this experience with a friend, I realized something. Probably just a creepy coincidence, but I'd said Jane was an artist, and that she always drew people as other things. Well, I saw many drawings of Patrick. She said he always wore this dark coat and ripped pants or something. She, as usual, didn't draw him as a human. She drew him as a skeleton. It really creeped me out for whatever reason when I remembered that. I may be forgetting some other weird things that happened, but that's the main stuff. Now to tie it all together, here is some stuff I've done about it since. I've tried using Google Earth to look at where his house was, since I remember exactly where she showed me. The trees are too thick to see in, and there is construction nearby, so it may not even be there anymore. I have not gone back in person since it is so far away, and also close to her house. I have Googled and researched in countless ways Patrick's name, both names, and anything I could remember. No useful results. She used to mention him on social media sometimes. A friend of mine, who had trouble grasping all this, found her profile and saw him mentioned recently too. I have a few theories. 1. Patrick was just a sort of imaginary friend, a character she made to fill the place of her much older brother who moved away, and she didn't see often. Her brother and Patrick were the same age after all, and Ken had similar personalities. I met her brother once. 2. It was all BS she made up for whatever reason, to impress me sometimes, to coerce me at other times. 3. It was part of a much greater disorder, problem which is possible. Jane had other issues that I will not disclose, so it isn't impossible. 4. Patrick did exist in some way, shape, or form, but she highly exaggerated him and rarely saw him. So she told me whatever she wanted about him. Kinda fits with the brother story. It may not be as creepy to all of you since you're on the outside of my social circle, but like I said, that's why I'm posting. But to me, Personally, I am bothered by this. Jane had a tendency to be very violent and say threatening things. Why did she make it all up? Why did she show me that house and say it was his? What was in the house? Regardless of if anyone lived there, did she ever actually go in, like she said she did? Did she sleep there sometimes or visit late at night like she said? If so, what in the world was she doing? Did someone really somehow live there? I really highly doubt it. Why did she draw him as a skeleton? Like I said, probably creepy coincidence. Why did he have such strong feelings about me? Why did she change his last name? Why did she do that weird thing with the phone and classmate? How many of her other loved ones knew about this? What would have happened if I went in that house with her? It was, as I said, brushed over during the end stages of our relationship, which were very unhealthy and bent. Some of this is probably heightened by my anxiety, but I do think it's a weird story. I plan on using it for a fictional story one day and, of course, changing some stuff for it, but anyways, thanks for listening. Edit. A few things. One, I now remember the bus phone call having a bit more to it, actually. I remember she actually got Patrick to call me back from his phone, too. An unknown number called me. It was the same guy as before, a similar conversation. She may have thought that proved her to be truthful, but it was obviously just her classmate's phone. Especially since a week or so later, after our contact was through, I called back that number and the guy answered with no knowledge of who Patrick Willingson was. So, small change of detail there, but it actually confirms the previous idea of it being a classmate even more. Secondly, thanks for all your comments, so I am well over what happened emotionally, mentally. I appreciate all your support. If anyone cares, I'm actually in a fantastic relationship now, and with someone I want to spend my whole life with. There have been some suggestions to go back to the house with friends and check it out. I mentioned in a comment that this has been considered before, but there are some problems. The house was actually 2 stories high, so I'm not sure if it's stable. She may have never went in at all, you know? Could have been lying about it. It may also not be there if the construction I saw on Google Maps continued, and of course, it's close to her house and an elementary school. So lots of potential for it to go badly, even with friends. If I ever do go back, I will take pictures and update. As for contacting her friends, her family to learn more, while I understand the desire for answers, I simply won't do that. Everyone's moved on and, hopefully, happy and better off now. So no need to start potential trouble. I for sure wish I had a complete explanation, but for now, you just have to guess and theorize, I suppose. Got some pretty solid answers and ideas. 2. When I was about 13, my auntie and uncle used to have a seasonal campsite at a smallish lake about 3 hours away from our town. It was nothing fancy, but it was a cheap summer vacation spot, and my whole family used to go up there lots. I often brought my friend, let's call her Kay, to stay with us, as I'm a lonely-ass only child and valued the company. Since the campground was so small, especially the seasonal sites, it really felt like home. We knew many people at the lake by name, and they knew us too. Most of the campground staff had grown accustomed to Kay and I riding our bikes, eating ice cream, and terrorizing the frogs down by the water. and they were all very friendly to us. Like I said, it felt like home. It's also probably worth mentioning that both Kay and I grew up in a very small Canadian town. One where everyone waves when you drive by on the street. No one locks their doors. And everyone is your friend. Moving on. One day, when we were down by the water at around sunset, we were sitting on the dock, dipping our toes in the water and just about to head back to our campsite for supper. We were spent from the day of roasting in the sun, biking and catching frogs. A disheveled man, maybe 40 or 50 years old, approached the dock behind us, and being the friendly young rural girls we were, we both waved hello and exchanged pleasantries with him. He continued to approach us, chatting politely about the weather and other small talky type shit. He was wearing a stained beer t-shirt, one of the ones that you used to get for free in a box of beer in the early 2000s, and dirty jeans. He had straggly, greasy hair and was missing a tooth. This might immediately set off red flags for you, but again, we were from a small town, and this dude looked like half of my dad's side of the family, so neither of us were fazed. During the course of our conversation, he sat down beside me on the dock, dipping his feet in the water alongside ours. He continued to chat with us, asking about what we had been doing that day, where our campsite was, who our parents were, that kind of shit. He said he knew my parents, that they were friends. We probably should have been smarter than to continue to talk with him, but being the only child that I was, I had always felt comfortable chatting with adults, and didn't bat an eye at the conversation. Plus, he knew my parents. What could go wrong? Eventually, he started asking us about boating. He pointed to a boat off the dock, a fancy one with a gold glittery finish, and asked if we liked it. We did. He told us that was his boat, and that it was the fastest and coolest boat on the lake. He asked us if we'd ever been to any of the secret islands on the lake. We said no. I remember thinking how odd this was, as the lake was truly not that large or impressive, so a secret island seemed strange, and hella enticing. He told us he owned one of the islands, and its name was Zeke. He asked us if we wanted to go to Zeke with him. We hesitated slightly, but ultimately wanted to go for a boat ride. By now the sun was nothing but an orange glow slipping into the horizon. We were just standing up to go towards the boat when my uncle came down the hill to the lake in his truck. He honked the horn and yelled at us to get our asses in the truck. We were supposed to be home by dark, and we were in shit. He threw our bikes in the box and we got in the truck. My uncle quizzically asked us who the man we were talking to was, and we told him he was some guy that knew my parents. We told him he was going to take us to his secret island in his cool boat. When Kay pointed out the boat to my uncle, he told us that the boat belonged to Phil, the owner of the convenience store at the lake. He then began to lecture us about why agreeing to go on a boat ride with a perfect stranger was not a good idea. He confirmed my suspicion that there were no islands in the small lake. We both began to feel kind of freaked out, which only continued when we told my parents about the man, and they were sure they didn't know him. My mom lectured the shit out of us and told us he probably wanted to wear our skin like a mask. Creepy man at the lake, rest on meat. 3. I'm a 33-year-old white female from Los Angeles. 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I, as planned for 5 years, turned 30, sold everything we owned, including my car, took his Trailblazer, and decided to just travel around the States and Canada. I guess you could call us backpackers. And we tend to chase good weather, find a state park and backcountry hike into the wilderness for days at a time. My brother likes to joke that we are anti-establishment hippies. We don't necessarily live off the grid, but between the two of us, we have one prepaid phone we use for emergencies or checking in with family and friends, and one MacBook, which I use for work. I'm a freelance writer, content creator, and I'm on retainer with a robotics company. I mostly write boring white papers or web content. The whole point of our living situation is we live debt-free and have as few bills as possible. I only use free Wi-Fi, so 1 to 2 times a week we have to go to a city with a Starbucks. This background info is only important so you know more about who we are and how simply we live. Neither of us is involved in social media, and know very little of Reddit or Instagram or use any apps because our phone isn't a smartphone. We don't even text. Last summer we decided to do some country hiking in Arkansas. It's one of those states you don't ever really hear about other hikers visiting. But we read that it has some beautiful natural landscape. It does. The rules at this particular park were pretty lax. We didn't need a permit. There were a few basic laws, guidelines. But there was no check-in needed. We had all the basics and had planned to do a 6-day hike, 3 in, 3 out. The whole time we were out there, we didn't see or hear another soul. But on day 1, we were preparing to move off trail and find a camping spot as it was getting near dusk. Half-mile off trail is usually the standard for us. We took what looked kind of like an animal trail, and about a half a mile out we saw a green 2-person tent. It was almost camouflaged in the foliage, so we came on it almost by accident. Some backpackers prefer privacy, others are more social. We're the more social type. We've had some great experiences camping near other backpackers, sharing stories, food, a joint or two. We were around 30 yards away from the tent. It was zip-closed, so my boyfriend shouted a greeting to make our presence known. No movement, and no sound. We assumed the green tent guy either wasn't around or didn't want to be bothered, so we started off in a new direction to get some distance between us. We camped. Never heard a peep. We moved along the next morning, completely forgetting about green tent guy. Until nearing the end of day 5 on our trek back. We were again looking for a spot to camp off the trail, and we came upon the green tent again. This isn't that unusual, but normally backcountry hikers keep moving, so we really weren't expecting it. The tent flap was open, so my boyfriend yells his greeting again, and nothing. My boyfriend wants to go check it out, saying it's weird, and maybe someone is hurt. I didn't like the idea from the get-go because even though we hadn't had any bad experiences personally, we'd heard enough stories from other backpackers about hermits and mountain men that want privacy, carry guns, etc. But my boyfriend assured me that we'd be fine, and if all else fails, offer him some weed to keep the peace and we'd go on our way. As soon as we get within 20 yards of the place, the smell of decomposition is intense. My boyfriend has been hailing his greeting over the last 20 yards. And once the smell hits him, he stops, turns to me and says, "What if we find a dead body?" My skin crawled. I was immediately afraid. I've never seen a dead body before and don't want to. The closer we got to the tent, the worse the smell got. I knew for sure we were going to walk in and see some old camper's rotting corpse. What we found was worse than that. Outside the tent was a dead doe's legs, all 4 of them covered in flies. It looked like the legs had been cut most of the way and then ripped off the rest of the way. It was a mess. Inside was the body and head of the deer, but the middle portion was swaddled in a blue fleece blanket that was blood-soaked at the bottom where the legs used to be. It was laying on its side, bottom facing the tent entry. The tail had been cut off, and the anus, vagina, were covered in dried blood and agape, like something had been penetrating it. The same with its mouth. The bottom portion was bent down at a scary, broken-looking angle. The tent was open, so we could see everything without having to go inside. Not that we would have anyway, because at this point, the smell was almost debilitating. There was a dirty, almost empty clear bottle of Jergens baby oil and a stained green and white fringed kitchen towel. That was it. I immediately started crying and begged him to go. All he could muster was, "What the fuck?" And we turned and ran. We ran to the trail and jogged down it for as far as we could go until dusk was fully on us. And we had to set up camp. We didn't go very far off the trail and neither of us slept. We didn't start a fire or use headlamps after full dark. We just sat up whispering to each other, going over and over what we had just seen. Every little noise startled us. It was like our brains were on red alert. I kept thinking any moment a dead deer rapist would come back to his tent, see our footprints, or something, know we were there and track us back to our tent. I've never been so scared in my entire life. Just before dawn, we tore down and started out. My boyfriend stopped at the ranger station on our way out of the park to report what we had seen. The ranger was a young guy, around our age, and he looked as freaked out by our story as we were telling it. He wrote most of it down, and my boyfriend showed him on a map, approximately where it had been. He asked if we knew how the deer was killed, and at that point, we hadn't even thought about it. We just assumed it had been shot, but because of the blanket, we didn't see a wound. And we weren't exactly giving it an autopsy either. We have since shortened our backcountry hikes to a maximum of 4 days. We've also been a lot less eager to call out to other campsites, and we have never approached another unmanned tent again.